A myth is something that some people, or actually most people, think are true, but actually is not true. For example, some people think that you can see the Great Wall of China from outer space. I heard that when I was a kid, but that's not true, right? And especially if you've ever been to Beijing, especially on a foggy day, you can't even see the wall from like 2 meters away, right? So there's no way you can see it from outer space. Just because the Great Wall of China is long, it's still only like 2 meters wide. So it's not that wide of a wall. So that's a myth. Another myth, I don't know if you've heard, that some people think are true, but it's actually not true, is the myth that humans only use 10% of their brain. That's false. That's a myth. That's not true. It makes for a good sci-fi movie because you think like, ooh, what if you can access 90% of your brain? Maybe you can like fly or move things with your mind. But that's not true. The fact of the matter is that our brain is divided into sections, and each section of our brain is used for different things. We don't always use all of the sections at one time, but we do use all of our brain. Okay, so that's a myth. Here's another myth that most people think is true, but it's actually not. And here's the myth. The myth is this: singleness is bad. Singleness is bad. It's just terrible. And that's a myth. That's not true. And I wanted to do this little mini-series on singleness and marriage, looking at the myths of singleness, looking at the myths of marriage. But this talk today on myths of singleness, it's not just for single people, it's actually also for married people. The fact of the matter is that if you're married, you will be single again, whether by death or by divorce. My father passed away 2 years ago, and my mom has been, for the past 2 years, has been learning to be a single person again and dealing with things like that. And so this message is not just for single people, it's for all of us. And so a lot of this information I got from a pastor by the name of Sam Albury, and I've been trying to get him to Shanghai to speak. Actually, he was supposed to speak this year, but because of COVID, couldn't come. But he wrote a book called 7 Myths of Singleness, and I got a lot of my information from him. One of the first myth, as we mentioned, is singleness is bad for you. And here, for the Christian, it's specifically the way the world sees it is even worse for the Christian, because when we talk about singleness as Christians, we're talking about not just the state of being single or the state of being unmarried, but being celibate, not having sex. And so in the world's eyes, that's just weird. That's just even dangerous or even unhealthy. I actually Googled the word celibate and movies, trying to see like what kind of movies talked about celibacy or books or something like that. And actually 2 movies that came, I haven't seen these movies, but one was called The 40-Year-Old Virgin by Steve Carell, and that's a comedy. Here's a person who's 40 years old and single, and it's supposed to be a funny movie. And the other movie was 40 Days and 40 Nights, and I've never seen the movie, but the description of the movie says, it's a comedy, and it says, a man will do the unthinkable, go 40 days and 40 nights without sex. And in our culture, it is unthinkable, even outright weird, to go without sex. And I think the response is, and I wanted to kind of get to this when we talk about each of these myths, but the response to that is Jesus was the ultimate human being who ever lived. And yet he was never married. He never dated. As far as we know, he had no romantic relationships. He never had sex. And so to state that, to believe the myth that singleness is bad for you, it diminishes the humanity of Jesus Christ. we tend to define singleness as the absence of all the good things about being married. And Paul, I wanted to take a look, our main text that we're going to take a look at today is 1 Corinthians 7. But here in this chapter, Paul does talk about singleness as the absence of something, but we're going to take a look at what he says it's the absence of. So turn to your Bibles with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 28, Paul says this, if you marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Yet such will have trouble in this life, and I am trying to spare you. Here, Paul is not putting down marriage. In fact, throughout the New Testament, Paul has wonderful things to say about marriage, but also Paul lives in reality. Paul understands the reality of marriage is when you stick two people together, two sinners together, there's going to be trouble. And you don't have to think too far about what some of those troubles may be when you're married. Statistically, 50% of marriages end in divorce. And that number is just about there here in Shanghai. And the number keeps growing in China. I know some Christian parents who have a child or children that have walked away from the faith. I have some married friends who have lost their spouse, even at a young age. Even just a couple of months ago, I was doing a funeral via Zoom for a friend of mine who I discipled when he was a young adult. Now he later on he got married and has a 4-year-old daughter, and he passed away, and his wife is a widower. I know parents who have lost their children in death, which is one of the most agonizing and painful experience a human being can go through. I know people whose spouse has been unfaithful and even walked out of their marriage. These are just some examples that Paul is talking about when he talks about troubles that single people will not have to face firsthand. You may be able to empathize with people going through divorce or adultery, but you won't have to experience that firsthand. As a single person, you are spared from a broken marriage. You are spared from having a spouse commit adultery. You're spared from having children who want nothing to do with Jesus Christ. So a lot of times we mistakenly compare the ups of marriage with the downs of singleness. But that's wrong, because there's a lot of ups in singleness and there's a lot of downs in marriage. And so I'm going to take a look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Let's turn there. And here I really appreciate Paul, because again, Paul lives in reality. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 32, listen to what he says here. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 32, Paul says, but I want you to be free from concern. Or I think in the ESV it talks about anxiety, and that's good. You know, Paul doesn't want us to live anxious lives. So that's good. Verse 32, but I want you to be free from concern. One who is unmarried is concerned about the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But the one who is married is anxious or concerned about the things of the world, how he may please his wife, and his interests are divided. Paul here in this chapter, let me just make it clear that he's not saying that if you're married, you cannot have devotion to the Lord. Nor is he saying that if you're single, you're going to have great devotion to the Lord. What he is saying here is that if you are single, you will have less distractions in doing Christian ministry. Those that are single are pulled in fewer directions than those that are married. A few weeks ago, I preached a message about legacy. And on average, a child from the age of birth to 18 years old, before college, from birth to 18 years old, it costs to raise that child about 4 million RMB.